Late night in New York City, the subway takes on a different kind of life. The usual bustle of commuters fades, replaced by eerie silence, interrupted only by the occasional screech of wheels on the iron tracks. Sarah stood on the platform waiting for the last train of the night. It was 1:35 a.m. and she had just missed a 1:30 train by seconds, watching as his tail lights disappear into the dark tunnel. Platform was completely deserted, save for the distant hum of a broken vending machine and the flickering of a faulty light overhead. The temperature felt colder than it should for an underground station, and Sarah pulled her coat tighter around her body. She stared down the tunnel, hoping to see the faint glow of the next train, but the darkness swallowed everything ahead. After what felt like hours, the sound of wheels grinding against the tracks finally echoed through the station, but it wasn't a normal sound. It was off, slower, as if the train was dragging itself through the tunnels. The train finally emerged, an old model Sarah hadn't seen in years. Its once white surface now rusted and coated with grime. The car windows were dark, offering no glimpse of passengers inside. The door creaked open with a shudder, and Sarah hesitated for a moment. The feeling that something was wrong gnawed at her, but exhaustion and the urge to get home overpowered her instincts. She stepped in. The car was dimly lit, the fluorescent bulbs flickering sporadically. There was no one else on the train, just her and the faint hum of the train's machinery. Sarah sat down, pulling out her phone to distract herself. No signal. A few minutes passed as the train rumbled along the tracks. She glanced at her phone again, trying to open up a map, but it kept buffering. Then she noticed something odd. The train hadn't stopped at any stations. The ride was longer than usual, and the landscape outside the window had changed. Instead of the tiled subway tunnels, there was nothing. Just endless blackness. No lights, no graffiti, no signs of any station. It was as if the train had left the subway system entirely and was traveling through an unknown void. Cars overhead, lights flickered again, but this time they stayed off longer than usual. In the darkness, Sarah heard a low growl coming from the far end of the car. It was subtle, but unmistakable, a sound that sent a chill down her spine. She turned toward the source, squinting through the dimness. At first there was nothing, just the empty rows of seats. Then she saw it. A shadow darker than the rest of the car stood at the far end. It was tall and vaguely human-shaped, but its proportions was wrong. Its arms were too long, its body hunched and twisted. It was moving slow and deliberate closer to her. Panic rose in Sarah's throat. She pressed the emergency stop button, but the train didn't respond. Frantically, she hit it again and again, but the car kept moving at its slow crawling pace. The shadow was now halfway down the car, its limbs dragging against the floor, the sound like nails scraping metal. Sarah jumped from her seat, running towards the opposite end of the car. She pounded on the door that led to the next car, but it was locked. Her breath quickened, her heart raced. The shadow was almost upon her. Now in the brief flickers of light, she could see its face, or what's supposed to be a face. It was featureless, a blank canvas of blackness, except for two hollow voids where eyes should have been. Without thinking, Sarah turned and ran back to her seat, fumbling through her bag. She needed something, anything to defend herself. Her fingers closed around a small flashlight and she pulled it out, flickering it on. She pointed it towards the shadow. The light hit the figure, and for a moment it froze. The groaning noise stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Sarah held her breath, keeping a flashlight trained on it. The creature didn't move, as if the light had paralyzed it. But then the train lurched, throwing her off balance. The flashlight tumbled from her grip, rolling down the aisle. The light blinked out, leaving her in total darkness. In the silence, she could hear the sound again. again, the scraping, the groaning, closer than before. The train rattled violently, and Sarah felt something cold brush against her leg. She screamed, jumping backwards, and her body hitting the hard metal wall of the car. Suddenly, the train screeched to a halt. The doors opened with a hiss, and bright fluorescent lights flooded the car. Sarah looked around, heart pounding, but the shadow was gone. The car was empty, just as it had been when she first boarded. Dazed, she stepped out onto the platform, her legs weak beneath her. She looked around, expecting to be at her destination, but the station was unfamiliar. There were no signs, no maps, just a long, desolate platform stretching out in both directions. The air smelled damp and musty, as if no one had been there in years. The train doors closed behind her with a heavy clink, and without warning it pulled away, disappearing into the tunnel once again. Sarah stood there alone in a strange station. Her phone still had no signal. She turned to look for an exit but found none. The lights overhead flickered again, and from somewhere deep within the shadows of the station, she heard the groaning sound once more. This time it was not far away.